All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming. Before we do get started, please silence your cell phones so you can listen uninterrupted. My name is Melissa Easton. I'm head of special collections here. If you're not familiar with our department, we're located up on the second floor just off of Reference. It's a big sign that says special collections. You can't miss us. We are a combined genealogy and history department. We've got the Baton Rouge Room Archives and the genealogy reading room. I encourage you all to check us out. Upstairs right now we've got a fun little display of back to school memorabilia. So items from schools that were in East Baton Rouge Parish. Lots of fun stuff to look at, lots of interesting yearbooks. So please do visit us upstairs. You can also find us on the library's homepage, www.ebrpl.com, and you'll see our little info guide, genealogy and Baton Rouge at the bottom. We do this monthly lecture series on the third Wednesday of every month. Next month in September, we have Hans Rasmussen from LSU coming to talk about their historical newspaper collection. If you're not familiar with this, it's an excellent and wonderful resource, and he's going to come and explain what it is and how they've done it and how you can access it. So if you love historical research as much as I do, I encourage you to come. It's going to be a really fun and interesting talk. But this month, we have Mr. John Hickey. Mr. Hickey is a native of Texas. He moved to Baton Rouge in 1943 with his family. He graduated from Baton Rouge High and LSU with a degree in history and then went on to get a degree in library science. He worked for the United States government in intelligence for a number of years and returned to Baton Rouge on his retirement in 1992. He also worked for the East Baton Rouge Parish Library multiple times. We're very grateful for his service. He's now a researcher, having compiled several indices relating to the Canary Islanders history, and he's here tonight to talk about the first Battle of Baton Rouge. So please give him a warm welcome.
The reason I've got two uniforms on is since I'm talking about a battle, I thought you would like to know I can talk about a battle. And so I'm going to be mentioning the Spanish period Louisiana. The costume is for that. So that's the incongruity of my attire. I spent 28 years commissioned service. I was primarily in a reserve school. We taught officer and enlisted courses. I'm a graduate of the Command and General Staff course of the U.S. Army, the Air War College, and I have taught for the National War College during the time I was in Northern Virginia. As an introduction, I was a librarian. When I worked, I was primarily in acquisitions. I acquired books, magazines, everything worldwide for the organization that I worked for. Spanish period Louisiana is not something well known to most people. The Spanish acquired Louisiana in 1763, just at the end of the 7 Years' War. We know it as the French and Indian War in the United States. That's what it's called in our history books. Well, looks better than it did the first time. There are the 13 colonies, Florida and Spanish territory. At the end of the war, before the end of the war, France gave to Spain its territory west of the Mississippi River and the Isle of Orleans. Also at the end of the war, the British, which had captured Havana during the war, traded with Spain, and the British took over Florida. And so everything except the Isle of Orleans, east of the Mississippi River, was British territory. Spain and England, I will use England and British back and forth, Spain and England had been at war 120 years between 1600 and 1800. And of course, this falls in within that category. At this particular time, the American Revolution has started, and in Louisiana, the Spanish government felt they needed to increase the size of the military force here in Louisiana. It was at that time just 8 companies, and they decided they wanted to double the number of troops under arms, and so they requested that the king set up a methodology to give them 700 men to create a 2nd battalion. The king ordered the recruitment to be done in the Canary Islands. The Canary Islands are a group of 7 volcanic islands off the coast of Africa, just opposite Morocco, and they had been in Spanish control for a number of years. The people from the Canary Islands are called Isleños. Isleños is a word like Yankee. Everywhere in the world, if you're from the United States, you're a Yankee. Here in Louisiana, we don't normally consider ourselves Yankees, but it's the way that it goes. Be that as it may, the people were recruited in the Canary Islands and they were shipped here, and I have an index over here that I created from the manifest of the ships that brought the Canary Islanders to Louisiana in 1779. At the same time, the Spanish government was actively aiding the American rebels in their fight for independence against the British, and doing every way that they could help in that area. The initial recruiting did not provide them with the single men that they really wanted, so many of the recruits who came had families with them. But the government didn't bother with that because the families would allow them to add a Spanish flavor to a part of the country which had few Spaniards in it. Mostly it was French, because the French had occupied the area for many years. So having those people where they could put around was very important to them. In 1769, with the revolt of the French people in New Orleans against Spanish rule, General O'Reilly was sent in to put down the revolt. He reorganized the defensive system in Louisiana, and what he did was he set it up so that the militia units were the primary defensive element in Louisiana, and that the regular forces were in New Orleans to serve as a backup. The reason was, in those days, how did you get around Louisiana? Well, with great difficulty, because the only way was waterways, and so they could not move military forces easily around the state, so it was important that the militia units existed. In 1779, the it's supposed to come back on. I didn't think I touched it. In 1779, Spain declared war against Great Britain, and and Galvez put the army together and marched from New Orleans to Bayou Manchac here, and then on to Baton Rouge, and that was the first Battle of Baton Rouge. Now, most people, when you say the Battle of Baton Rouge, which one do they think of? Civil War. Unfortunately, that's the third Battle of Baton Rouge, not the first. And I will mention the other in just a moment. As he moved upriver from New Orleans toward the Bayou Manchac area, he collected the militia units that existed along the way. German coast, a Canadian coast, from Opelousas, from Attakapas, and brought those people across the river, and they were part of the force that went all the way to Baton Rouge. Shoot, darn it. I lost myself again. When the first action on the battle really was the British line of communications was across the lakes, up the Amite River and down Bayou Manchac. And the first action in this campaign was the capture of a couple of supply ships on the Amite River by the garrison at Galvez Town, which was the only town the Spanish built from the ground up while they were here. And so the first real military action was at Fort Butte here, just across Bayou Manchac in British territory. And it was the militia that made the assault on Fort Butte. The regular forces were set up as a blocking force to keep reinforcements from coming from Baton Rouge. After Fort Butte was taken, there were very few people there. Then they moved on to Baton Rouge and invested the fort there at Baton Rouge. West Florida. Believe it or not, West Florida was created by the British during the years after 1763 when they controlled Florida. They divided Florida about right in here. And then later, the distances was changed as far as that goes. The fort at Baton Rouge was captured. It was an odd thing because it was not an assault by troops to capture the fort. What Galvez did was he set up a action east of the fort to keep the people at the fort busy while he set up a artillery position on the corner of Lafayette and North Boulevard. And there's a sign on that little piece of parkland there that notes that this is where Galvez had his artillery position. And then they bombarded the fort for a couple of hours and the fort surrendered. So that was the sum grand total of the Battle of Baton Rouge. Then the next year, in 1780, Galvez moved over and captured Mobile from the British, and the following year, in 81, he captured Pensacola from the British. And this effectively took away all British control in the northern Caribbean, in the northern Gulf of Mexico, and also all of the forces they had there were not available for the British to use in the American Revolution going on. In addition, whoops. In addition, Natchez was also surrendered at the time of the Battle in Baton Rouge. I mentioned that the Canary Islanders had been brought in and divided up among settlements. Galvez picked settlements that would help in defending New Orleans from a possible British attack, because this was something that had been feared by the Spanish government ever since they had been given New Orleans in 1763. was the possibility of a British attack because the British had eyes on the mineral wealth that existed in Central America. And this would have been a path to that, so this was a blocking position and the reason the Spanish took it over. All the actions, and a couple of others that I will mention, these are actions of the American Revolution. So Louisiana is unique in having several actions, and I'll mention a couple others, that are Revolutionary War battles. And people who participated in those battles are recognized as veterans of the American Revolution and eligible to join the SAR and the DAR, as are all of the Canarians who were brought, because they were brought as recruits, even though they came with families. They were still classified as recruits, and they are recognized as also candidates for the same thing, DAR and SAR. The 4 settlements that Galvez selected was Barataria, St. Bernard, Valenzuela, and Galvez Town. I had mentioned that Galvez Town was the only place that the Spanish built a town from the ground up. Every place else in Louisiana, they occupied what had been French before, such as Fort Miro up in Monroe and Natchitoches and New Orleans and that sort of thing. That's the 1797 map of the town of Galvez Town. We have done archaeological work on that site before the gentleman that owns it refused us access to it. We have not really found much of anything there that we could specifically date or name what it is or anything else. But that is the layout of the town in 1797. And from surveys that I have been able to find for different lots, and this is the name of the streets that existed in that town. And the American State Papers, which are the list of the claims that people made for land after the United States took over Louisiana, names all of these streets in the individual claims that people made for lots in Galvez Town as it went through. I mentioned other battles. We had Baton Rouge, Mobile, and Pensacola. Natchez, Washita, and St. Louis were 3 other military actions that took place in 1780 or 1781, where the British, mainly with their Indian allies, attacked Spanish territory, and the militia units from Atacapas and Opelousas were called out to support these actions at Natchez and Washita. The militia that existed at St. Louis held off a pretty sustained attack in 1780, again by the British, mainly with their Indian allies. So, I'm kind of rushing, I see. The Canary Islanders have pretty well been assimilated into the population since they arrived in 1779. The settlement at Valenzuela had a large number of Acadians settled there in 1785 when the 7 ships came in. The other places like Galvez Town and St. Bernard did not have as many Acadians attached to them as Valenzuela did. So if you come from the Bayou Lafourche area, or your family comes from the Bayou Lafourche area, it doesn't matter whether you're a Hernandez or a Broussard or a Trahan, you probably have a Spanish grandfather, grandmother, great-grandfather, or great-grandmother in your genealogy. And fortunately here in Louisiana, we have extremely good records in the church records that we have, and in the records that were made, and particularly in the Valenzuela area, Bayou Lafourche area, with a number of censuses naming people, members of the family, and all of that sort of thing as it happens. So the Canarians have kind of disappeared. We don't know them. You can't walk down the street and say there's a Canarian, because there's nothing that really identifies them. Each year in March, there is a festival down in St. Bernard, which is open to anybody. Hopefully they're planning on having one in 22, right? Yeah, 22. COVID has canceled the last 2 for them, so 22 is the time they're planning to have another one. Usually there is a group of some sort that comes from the Canary Islands who performs during the festival period. But there are other things that still exist that you don't notice. How many of you use melitone when you're cooking? Okay, the Spanish brought it. How many of you like jambalaya? You know, one thing that doesn't grow in Acadia, where the Acadians came from, is shrimp. So what you're really having is paella, which is a rice dish with seafood in it that the Spanish have made for years, which is being brought into Louisiana. You don't see it. So really there is a lot of Spanish elements in the society that just are hidden and you don't see them, but they exist nonetheless, and they were brought in by these people when they came. About 2,500 Canarians came in. 400 of them were settled at Galvez Town early in 1779. Within 1 year, 161 of them were dead. I have recently been able to find information on the cemetery at Galvez Town from the period 1779 to 1805. I can come up with a little over 300 burials. Caucasian. There are probably also slaves there, but we do not know the exact site of the cemetery. So the Canarians played a very strong part in the American Revolution, because St. Louis, one of the reasons the British attacked St. Louis was that St. Louis had been a supply point for George Rogers Clark, who operated in the Northwest Territories during the American Revolution. And that was one of the reasons the British attacked that particular site. So there is also a very large collection of correspondence between Galvez and George Washington on relating to things relating to the American Revolution that you can find in microfilm records. LSU has a good selection of those things, among other things. The main record for the Canary Islanders, or what we know about them, comes from a group of paper called the Cuban Papers. When the Spanish left Louisiana, they collected up all of their government documents and everything, which they were supposed to leave, but they did not. They sent them to Cuba. And eventually those materials were collected up and sent to the General Archives of the Indies in Sevilla, Spain. In the early 1900s, the Sons of the American Revolution wanted to get recognition for the people from Louisiana who had participated in the American Revolution. So they went to AGI and Sevilla, and they identified a block of records that pertained to Louisiana, and those records were microfilmed. And LSU has a copy of that microfilm. The only catch is you have to be able to read Spanish. I don't. Fortunately, I can tell what a list looks like, and I can recognize names. And it is by going through that book that I was able to find several ship manifests in addition to the ones that show up in other previous indexes that had been created for the people coming from the Canary Islands. And so I think I have a pretty complete list of all of the people who came from the Canary Islands, who came to Louisiana. We have found a number of people also who show up in church records that claims they come from the Canary Islands, that we do not have a manifest for them. But there was a continual flow of people from Cuba and Mexico into Louisiana all during this period. So people could have arrived from Cuba or from Mexico, from the Canary Islands via Cuba and Mexico, and gotten into Louisiana that way. So we've got about 2,800 names in my index that covers the vast majority of all the people who came. The index also shows if they were, where they were placed, if they were placed in a settlement. If I have some other information on them, like a church record, there are some notations for those in one section of that index. The library here has a copy of that index that I've just updated with the final index. We're hoping to publish that book one of these days and make a wider audience for it. Okay, I did better than I thought. I talk fast. Questions? Yes,
I have a
sir.
question. My name is Kirby Gordon. Okay, and I'm a middle school teacher at Galvez Middle. And I have a question about Bernardo de Galvez and his travel to Baton Rouge. You mentioned that he moved along towards Baton Rouge through the parishes. And I just want you to clarify, because we have been teaching that he sailed down to Baton Rouge, and I want to make sure that I'm accurate when I teach my lesson next time.
No, he did not sail. They marched. They had boats, which carried things like their artillery and ammunition, but they actually marched on the land from New Orleans to Bayou Manchac and then on to Baton Rouge.
Thank you.
And you do not sail up the Mississippi River. You sail down the Mississippi River, but you do not sail up the Mississippi River. That's one thing. By the way, my wife attended Galvez Elementary.
Many years ago.
Okay, and last but...
I actually have a follow-up question to that. How long did it take him to march from New Orleans to Baton Rouge?
Took them about 3 weeks.
After they rescued their boats.
Well, when they started putting the force together in New Orleans, a hurricane hit and sank most of their boats. So they had to raise all their boats and get them repaired so that they could move their heavy supplies by boat upriver. But it took them about 3 weeks cross country. They did not have much in the way of tents or anything like that. It was just slogging through to get up to Bayou Manchac. When they got to Bayou Manchac and after they captured Fort Butte, they rested there for a couple of days before they continued on to Baton Rouge.
How large was the force of men? How many people were in this?
How big was their force? How many people?
Yeah, on the way
The
back.
fort at Baton Rouge had just been thrown together. It was just a dirt thing with a moat around it. I don't have the numbers on that. They had a few troops there, and then they had locals, like a militia, who were there. But there was no real military action there other than the artillery bombardment before the fort surrendered. Now at Butte, there was an actual assault by individuals on the fort there, and it was done by the militia, as I said earlier.
How many people did the Galvez have?
He had about 1,600.
I'm curious, how many did they start with in New Orleans? And I'm assuming they picked up militias along the way.
They didn't lose, as near as I can tell from the records, they didn't lose that many people on the march.
But did they gain people? Did they pick up militias along the German coast and the Acadian coast? Yes. Did they pick up militias in between New Orleans and Baton Rouge?
Well, those were the only ones, were the ones on the German coast and the ones on the Acadian coast. So the only ones that were right on the river as he marched. Across the river now, you had St. James and Iberville, Attakapas, and Opelousas, and all of those were part of it. The Point Coupee militia, the Point Coupee militia also was part of the campaign. They crossed north of Baton Rouge and they set up a blocking position to keep any force coming down from Natchez. So all of the militias in the local area here were used during this campaign.
Yes, John, a question about Galvez and conscription. Was he permitted, was he under authority to conscript those settlements into our revolutionary forces, or was he fighting independently against the British?
The militia units?
Yeah.
No, the militia units, as I said, O'Reilly had set up the militia units with a primary military force. The regular force in New Orleans was only a backup. But he did take the regular force to Baton Rouge and picked up a militia on the way. The New Orleans militia was left in New Orleans to protect New Orleans. But the German coast, which had 2 companies, the Acadian coast, which had 2 companies, the St. James, the Iberville, Attakapas, and Opelousas. They claim, they don't name these people, they merely say on the route he picked up 600 militia men to add to the force on the march. But these are the only people he could possibly get to. That comes from that other hat, by the way. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
I think the confusion is when you use the term conscription, that doesn't really apply, because under the Spanish law, people in the militia owed service to the king as from a military unit. The Spanish regular army was completely volunteer, and they had many Louisianans join the Spanish army in New Orleans. Matter of fact, I think, John, if you look at some of the records of the Louisiana Spanish regiment, you'll see names like Dupree and Landry and O'Neill.
Right.
These are people that joined the Spanish army in New Orleans, but they were regulars. The militia were local citizens who were meeting their obligation to the king.
The militia units were set up that each settlement created a militia unit. They had their own officers. They assigned their own officers. The way it worked was when they had a muster call, everybody who was able had to respond to the muster call. And most all of the settlements had a few regular soldiers to help train the militia in a minor way as to how to march and which end of the rifle the bullet, the gun the bullet comes out of. And that's another thing. All of the weapons in this particular period were not rifles, they were all muskets. So the companies were not rifle companies, they were fusilier companies. Took me a while to learn that one too, by the way. But no, and so they held musters on a regular basis. We have a few muster lists from some of the settlements. I have found a muster list for practically every company for the Revolutionary period. And I have an index I've made of that too, Louisiana Militia. And there's a copy of that upstairs also. I also went through the Cuban Papers and selected out rosters for the Louisiana Regiment for the period, those that I could read. That's another shortcoming in the Cuban Papers. The microfilming of the records was not done very well in some cases. So I also have an index for the Louisiana Regiment for its period from 1765, when the first company was brought in with the first governor, till 1800. I couldn't find enough readable rosters after 1800 to carry on to the 1805 time, when the regiment left and went to Florida, excuse me.
We have a
Yes, sir.
question.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
I'm trying to use the mic so we can capture it for our recording.
What, if anything, did Oliver Pollak do to assist R.A. Galvez in his march to Baton Rouge?
Ma'am?
Oliver Pollak, what, if anything, did he assist Galvez with his battle in Baton Rouge, his march and his battle? I've read accounts of his assistance with
Oliver
Galvez.
Pollak.
Ma'am?
Oliver Pollak.
Oliver Pollak was a representative of the American Revolutionary Government here in Louisiana. There were a few people with him, but he was not really, he was kind of like an observer, you might say. Interesting thing, the painting of the surrender of the fort at Baton Rouge has an American flag in the background.
A current American, I mean,
American
with
flags
stars
did
and
not
stripes.
exist in 1779. That's a literary license, I guess is the best way to put it. Should have had something, what was it?
Do we have another question?
Yes?
All right, actually, I've got two questions. The first is, was it Bernardo de Galvez was the fellow's name? He was kicking butt all around the area. He had battles in, was it Galveston, right? Galveston, Texas is named after him. Is that correct?
I think so, but that's long after.
That's what I was gonna ask you, where that
There was no
celebrated
battle
chronology.
If you put in, you go to the internet and you put in Galvez Town with a Z,
Right,
you find you're getting Galveston, Texas,
right.
most of the time.
I thought he won a battle there somewhere in that chronology, because he fought battles in Mobile, Baton Rouge,
Pensacola.
and, yeah, and also, southeastern Texas, or, yeah, southeastern Texas, I believe, right? No?
He did nothing in Texas.
Okay. The second question I have is, the Battle of Baton Rouge. They were, one of the parties was over off of South Boulevard, with lobbying ammo into, the Fort of Baton Rouge, is that correct? Is that the direction that the artillery came from?
The artillery post was there on the corner of Lafayette and North Boulevard.
Okay,
There used to be an old water tower there, if you lived in
Oh,
Baton Rouge
yeah.
long enough.
It's still there.
thank you.
And the fort was, if you go down to the Pentagon Barracks
Mhm.
and you park on the south side of the Pentagon Barracks, you will see on the ground a brick wall that looks like a fort. That is a much later fort that existed on that site, and that wall is there to show its position. But that's where the fort was,
Okay.
right there. Okay,
And we have another question here.
Yes, did any Indian allies participate in Galvez's army? And if so, do we know what tribes?
Not that I'm fully aware of. There may have been some, but at the time, the tribes were not that prevalent in this area.
John?
John.
I think the Attakapaw, were in the militia units, they were
There
Attakapaw.
probably was some, because they had been pretty much becoming amalgamated into the general society. So they could have been mustered into the militia company when they were called up. I can't remember all of them. I used to be able to. 4 people have been granted honorary citizenship in the United States. The first one was Winston Churchill. The last one was Bernardo Galvez. 4. And he was one of them. There's a nice statue of him down in New Orleans, down on the waterfront down there, that was dedicated several years ago in recognition of his contribution. He left shortly after all of the campaigning was over and got reassigned somewhere else in the Spanish governmental area.
Got another question on here, I think.
Yes.
We've got another microphone coming.
No working line.
3 weeks is a long time to come up that coast. It's long enough for people to get sick. What about diseases that might have happened with the soldiers as they went from New Orleans up to Baton Rouge? Did they have any disease outbreaks?
There was a level of sickness because after the capture at Fort Butte, they sat at that position there for several days while some of the people who had gotten sick along the way were recuperated before they continued on to Baton Rouge.
Yellow fever or?
I have seen no record of any indication that there was any specific condition that existed to such a degree that it affected them materially. Just 3 weeks tripping through Louisiana, and several years ago we had a visitor from the Canary Islands. We took him down to Valenzuela, and Valenzuela was nice and clean, had a nice field out there, but right along the bayou there was this area of trees with all the vines and everything in them. I said, that's what it looked like when they got here. When they got off the boat, that's what it looked like. Not this. It looked like that. So when they came in, the Canary Islands are volcanic, I'm sorry. It is hot and dry. I've been there. I'd like to go back, but I've only been there once. When they got to Louisiana, of all of the things Louisiana is dry is not one of them. You do not have much in the way of beasties in the air in the Canary Islands, as you have in Louisiana. Evidenced by, I mentioned the 400 settlers at Galvez Town, 161 of them were dead within the first year. That was man, woman, and child. It wasn't any specific category of people. Whole families went during that period, that first year in Galvez Town. Yes, sir.
The question I have concerns Fort Butte. How heavily was it staffed? Do you know anything about the size of that particular?
It was a very, very small mud thing that they had just put up. The British were not aware that war had been declared between Spain and Great Britain. So when Galvez showed up on the scene, then they knew. But the British recognized they could not defend Fort Butte. So there was only like 20 men and an officer who were at Fort Butte when Galvez got there and assaulted the fort. It was just a very temporary mud structure thing. Unfortunately, either the Fort Butte, or the one in Baton Rouge, neither one of them do we have good information on what they were like. The only good information we have on a fort is in 1797, the governor decided to build a new fort at Galvez Town, and there is a beautiful rendition of a fort in a guy named Scramuzza's thesis on Galvez Town in the
LSU thesis.
yeah, it's an LSU thesis, but a copy of it is in the Louisiana history. They have it upstairs. I don't remember which volume right offhand, but it was a fantastic thing. They never built it.
What was the second battle of Baton Rouge?
Second Battle of Baton Rouge was 1810,
Okay, that's West Florida.
when the
West Florida, right.
Anglos in the area revolted against Spanish rule and kicked out the governor in Baton Rouge and created the West Florida Republic. And at that time, West Florida went all the way to the current border with Florida, Alabama and Florida. That was West Florida at this time. I had mentioned earlier that the British were the ones who had created West Florida, but under them, West Florida was more. It went all the way over toward the Apalachicola, thank you, river. So it was a larger territory. But Baton Rouge was the capital for West Florida. And so once they captured Baton Rouge, then all Spanish control in the area disappeared. And they created West Florida Republic. And 10 days later, the United States said, we want it, and they moved in. So West Florida didn't last too long.
The line of Manchac and Amite River, the line between the two countries.
International border.
Yeah.
Bayou Manchac has twice been an international border. From 1763 until 1779, it was a border between Spain and England. In 1803, it became a border between America in the south because we bought the Isle of Orleans, and the Spanish in the north because they still control the Florida parishes. So twice Bayou Manchac has been an international boundary.
All right, any other questions?
Mine not a question, but John, the gentleman's question, there's kind of thing interests me with it. Galvez never set foot in Galveston.
Ma'am?
He sent a group of people to chart the Gulf Coast, and they named it.
Okay.
Okay.
A librarian. All right, anything else? All right, well, thank you, Mr. Hickey, that was wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Very good, John.
We have a Canary Island Historical Society, and we try to meet. One of these days, we're going to meet face to face again. It usually is announced in different places. We meet over at Bluebonnet Library if we get a chance to meet. So keep us in mind. You're more than welcome.